Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone here for sort of taking the time today to spend together in this intro to SageVue. And so we're going to spend the next hour today talking about a number of topics SageVue related. And as you can sort of see this list running down, we've got quite a number of things we're going to touch on today. So it will be a jam-packed hour. We'll sort of dive into each of these in sort of varying degrees of depth. At least touch on them in some capacity. And as always, anything that comes up, always feel free to reach out to our support team, our global technical support team at support@biamp.com. Be happy to help in any way. So with that said, let's get going. So SageVue, for those of you that don't know, is Biamp's network monitoring and management system. It's going to be installed on a physical machine on-prem, and is designed to sort of oversee a variety of our product families. So at this point, SageVue supports Tesira, Devio, our QT and Dynasound sound masking products, as well as the CrowdMic's product family. A couple different ways you can access SageVue. By default, when you install SageVue, you're getting a web GUI that you can access from browser. But we also expose an API. So SageVue is built on top of a REST API. And so we have some help documentation, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation as well. So if you want to, you can use that built-in web browser or pull information from SageVue into, if you have a third-party NMS or network management system there. Sort of taking a step back, looking at a high-level overview of the sort of network hierarchy involved with SageVue. When you're downloading and installing SageVue, the heart of this is that SageVue manager there in the center. So that's a service that's going to be running on the Windows machine there, and the SageVue manager is going out on the network and you're talking to all the various product families that SageVue supports. Each of those having sort of their own ports and protocols that they need to utilize. That all gets funneled down to that SageVue manager, and all that information sort of filtered, parsed out, and presented to you via that web UI, or again available via that RESTful API. This can all live standalone, isolated within your environment. However, there also is, if the Windows PC or Windows Server that's hosting SageVue has access to the internet, there's also some additional features such as cloud support and automatic firmware downloads, firmware library that are accessible there. Those are all optional, but nice features if you have access to the internet on the machine that's running SageVue. And so this presentation, a colleague of mine and myself, we put together, and we really wanted this to be not just information that I can talk to you today about and present, but a good reference for you going back. So whether you're already using SageVue or you're new to it, this presentation is, we're going to walk through the sort of the installation portion of SageVue, getting SageVue set up and running. We'll take a tour through that web GUI, and then take a little bit deeper dive into some of the workflows of the features within SageVue. So even after this presentation, when all said and done, there'll be a recording of this presentation as well as a slide deck provided. So hopefully this will be a good resource for you moving forward. Recall any of the things that we went through here if you've run into them in your own SageVue setup in your environment. So let's hit the ground running here with the installation and activation. So there are some minimum requirements we need to consider. All of this is available via the SageVue FAQ, which is located on Cornerstone. I got the URL down on the bottom. I'll also provide this at the end on the last slide of the presentation here for you as a resource link. But SageVue can run on a standalone Windows PC. So if you're interested in getting started here, you can download and install PC or SageVue on your own PC there, and get up and running with it. We also support a couple of varieties of Windows Server. There are some minimum firmware requirements for each of the product families SageVue supports. At this point in time, I'd expect, most new installs that are going in, these firmware minimums should be satisfied. It's good to note if you're going to be going into some older installs that have, pre-existing hardware, you want to make sure they're all at least up to this, the versions posted here before deploying SageVue. We're browser agnostic, so really any default browser, your browser of choice there would be available to you. And there are a few installation dependencies. So, SageVue, as part of its install, is going to take advantage of .NET Core. The web service is hosted via IIS. So as part of the install, we'll make sure to check and enable and or install these dependencies as needed. Again, all this information is available via that SageVue FAQ on Cornerstone. So to get started, we first need to download SageVue. Downloading SageVue is a very simple process. It does require a Biamp.com account. So for those of you that have one, you can use your existing credentials to log in. For those of you that don't, welcome. You can create a username and password here. But either way, you're going to navigate to the biamp.com/SageVue-request. That'll give you the prompt there to either log in or sign up, creating a new Biamp.com account. Once logged in, you'll be presented with a download link for SageVue, and you can download that right away and get off and running. We also have a link there to the SageVue deployment guide. Once you've downloaded SageVue, installation is pretty straightforward. Common Windows installation. Do want to note it requires an administrative account on that host machine. As part of the installation, we're going to check for all those installation dependencies we mentioned in the last slide. A couple points throughout the presentation here. We're going to point out a few locations on the Windows PC or server where SageVue is installed to. Again, the main user interface here is via web browser. So there's not, under normal use cases, there's not necessarily any reason to need to navigate to these locations to run SageVue. Just want you, especially if you're administering the server SageVue's on, might be helpful to know, sort of where SageVue is sort of installing itself to. So as we see here, we have the manager service, that SageVue manager service that's running in the background, among some other utilities related to the SageVue itself. Installation is going to require a reboot, and this is really where that administrative account requirement comes into play. So you're logged in with the administrative account. After the initial first portion of the install, it's going to reboot. You want to log back in with that same administrative account. And once you're logged back in following that reboot, SageVue is going to prompt you for an activation. And so we'll take a look at that process now. So first is install, followed by reboot, and then we have the SageVue activation process. So SageVue activation, once you log back in, you're presented with that window. Assuming you have internet access on the PC or server you're installing, you're going to go ahead and hit that start button there. This is going to prompt you for a Biamp.com ID and password. This doesn't necessarily need to be the same credentials you use to download SageVue, but it will be the credentials and the account that's tied to this instance of SageVue. So typically this will be the user who's sort of the main point of contact or admin for this instance of SageVue. So you enter credentials, and next you get prompted to give SageVue a name. And this is a pretty important step. You want to give it something descriptive, right? Something that, especially if you're managing multiple instances of SageVue, you want a descriptive name that's going to let you know, that this is either SageVue installed on this server or in this geographic location. Because if you have multiple instances of SageVue, and we'll take a look at this later, you can log into a SageVue portal to sort of manage and view all the SageVue gateways that are registered to your account. Once you give that a name, the activation process is going to confirm that account's registered to this instance of SageVue. And we need to create a way to access SageVue via that web browser in the first place. So really one of the last steps here in the activation process is going to be able to create that first admin username and password. So you're going to put all these details in here. Make sure to note that because you'll need that for first login. We also give you an option to configure LDAP settings right off the bat. So this is you can set up where to tell SageVue to point to your directory server for LDAP integration. However, this can be done after the fact in the web GUI. So at a minimum here, we need to get a admin username and password entered. But once you've gone through all that, essentially your activation is complete. So we've gone through that installation activation step. You'll get this confirmation here, and you can actually launch right into the browser and start using SageVue right away. I do want to point out, it could be commonplace if the server you're installing this on may not have internet access. We have that activate offline button that's also available, and we have a step-by-step guide on Cornerstone. It's a pretty straightforward process, but does require pulling some data from sort of like a license key and data from SageVue here, and you will need another computer that has internet access. But there is a workflow related there if the server doesn't have offline access, and we do have, like I said, a step-by-step guide available for you to review for that. So if we're to hit that launch button after activation, that's going to make SageVue right off the bat. That's going to take us to localhost/Biamp SageVue. So localhost is essentially telling our browser that that website is hosted locally on this machine. So you could, might be helpful to think of that similar to like a loopback address. You could replace localhost there with the 127.0.0.1 address and essentially save the same purpose. And that's fine. You don't need to go past, do much configuration past this point if that works for you. A common use case here might be, if you're installing it on your local PC to just, monitor a handful of rooms on site, or, post a new install, you want to check out the systems on there via SageVue, and you're just running this on your local machine. This is enough at that point. However, in a lot of instances, especially if you have multiple buildings or a larger campus, you may want to make SageVue accessible from other computers on the network via their browsers. And so natively, SageVue is not set up to do that. So we're not going to get into a sort of large, deep philosophical discussion on IIS configuration and all the ins and outs of there, but more so want to present this, especially for those of you maybe with more AV backgrounds who haven't had to talk about IIS or haven't had to interact with it in any way. So IIS is Microsoft's sort of built-in web server service, web server software. Comes with most installs of Windows, and this is where the website for SageVue is hosted. And so when SageVue is installed, these bindings are made internally in IIS, and these bindings are essentially rules that help IIS know when requests come in, what web page needs to be served up. And so when SageVue is installed, we install two bindings for HTTP and HTTPS, both related to that local host. So again, right off the bat, you can access it from the browser on that same machine SageVue is running via that localhost URL. Giving you sort of a visual of what that looks like. So we've got the URL on the bottom there. We make requests that are going to come in to IIS. This is via localhost, port 80 or 443. We'll make that query to IIS, and IIS, it's going to know exactly what to do, and we'll get that web page served up to our browser. However, let's say we're on a remote machine. We know the IP address of the server that's running SageVue is 192.168.1.12. We can ping that IP address. So we try to go to our browser. We replace localhost with 192.168.1.12 from a remote machine. But IIS natively is not going to know what to do with that. It has those bindings are strictly related to localhost at this point. So this is an example of sort of a quick change that can be done to sort of expose and gain access from SageVue from a remote machine. So you can go in and manipulate IIS, adjust those bindings, clear out that localhost, essentially telling IIS that any requests that come in on those ports to serve up the SageVue address. So with just a simple change like that, we go back to that same example. We come in with a 192.168.1.12 from a remote machine. IIS is going to know exactly what to do with that. So again, this isn't there's a variety of ways to configure IIS. If we're talking about HTTPS, there's SSL certificates and things that are involved. If there's other websites that are hosted, there's going to be other considerations. This again is not a deep dive into all things IIS, but for those of you out there who haven't run into this before, just know that there are additional steps that will be needed. Likely, if you're working with an on-site network admin, they'll be the ones who you need to coordinate with to make these changes. And of course, here we're showing an example with accessing it via the IP address. If you want to access it via a more friendlier URL, there's going to need to be some sort of a DNS configuration involved externally as well. Okay, so we spent a bit here talking about sort of getting SageVue installed and set up, different ways of accessing it via the browser. So I think it seems like a good opportunity to just jump right into the browser. So we have a demo system set up here that I'm going to be hitting. You can see the URL up there. I'm going to log in with my username and password. And as soon as we log in here, we're going to be taken right away to the systems menu. So we're going to spend some time here in the browser going through a tour of some of the common menu locations, common button icons in those locations, and then we're going to switch back into the PowerPoint presentation to go through some of these features in a little more depth. So in the top left here, you'll see name of the user that's logged in. We support importing sort of custom avatars, or if we have an LDAP integration, we'll pull in an image from the directory server if that's available. Systems list here. Systems is very much a Tesira terminology. So in the system list here, we're going to see any Tesira systems on the network, and that's going to be, a Tesira system is one or more Tesira devices that are involved in a single configuration. So we'll see a list of all our active systems on the network. In the top here, we've got sort of this nice view of the number of active systems we see. If we have any systems reporting faults, we'll get that little notification here. We have this concept of asset groups. So asset groups can be used to sort of organize devices, whether that's floors in a building, if you have maybe different types of rooms, different geographic locations. So we can filter the list view via asset groups up here. Top right-hand corner, we'll reference this quite a bit here. These are convenience buttons. These will update and change depending on the which portion of SageVue you're looking at. So here in our default view, we have this alarm bell, which is going to show us any sort of notifications or faults that might be present on any of our devices or systems. We have an option to update firmware as well as a browser refresh. I also want to make sure to point out here the help icon in the top right. So this is contextual help depending on what page you're on. So if you're working with SageVue, you're in a particular section, have some questions about it, just navigate up to that top right-hand corner, hit that help icon, and that'll take you to the appropriate section of the SageVue help guide. From our systems list here, we can actually dive a little bit deeper into each system. And so, for example, here we have a system that has multiple devices. So we clicked on the system name, we see our 2 devices that are a part of that system. We get some information about that device, such as the model and serial number. If we look at our convenience buttons in the top right, those have changed a little bit, right? So we still have our update firmware icon, we still have our contextual help, but we have some additional icons here that we'll take a look at later in the presentation. And these are related to system security here. We have this S icon is for SageVue control, which we'll talk about. And then this X icon actually allows you to clear system configuration. So we do have the ability to both send layouts to Tesira systems as well as clear system configurations there. Back buttons are always in the top left-hand corner of the browser window here, and that'll take us back to our main view. And we'll go through a little bit more here. Devices. The devices section is sort of an exploded view of systems. So this isn't, if we're looking at systems, if we have multiple devices, they will all show individually here. So here we see the 2 devices we saw in that executive suite system, as well as devices that are associated with other Tesira systems. This is also where you're going to start to see hardware from other product families. So in this particular network, I have a couple of Devio devices indicated by the D icon. You also see, if you're monitoring any QT or Dynasound, they'll show up in this list as well the CrowdMics add-on. So again, systems is strictly Tesira systems. Devices is where you're going to see all the, sort of all the hardware. A global view here. Status column will show us if we're dealing with any faults on any of our systems. We'll have information related to the serial numbers. If these are part of a Tesira system, we'll have reference there for that as well. Similar to that systems list, we can click in here a little deeper, and this will be device dependent as well. So from here, we get more information about the individual device itself. Again, it's serial number, its IP address, what firmware version it's running. We can manipulate network settings on the device. If the device has VoIP capabilities, all the VoIP settings can be managed. So for those of you familiar with Tesira software, we have a sort of a subset of controls that are available there exposed. 802.1x configuration, if you're using that on your network, we can load certificates and set configure that from here as well. And we can also get into device logs. So there's going to be logging here that's device specific related to SageVue that we'll see here in this list. We also have the ability to actually retrieve Tesira event logs from the devices via SageVue as well. And again, from the individual device list, convenience buttons, want to draw your eye back up to that right-hand corner again. From the convenience button icon, when we're looking at devices, we have the options to reboot devices, as well as still manage firmware. We've seen the padlock icon before. This is for locating devices. So we have a device locate feature that's common through Tesira we can utilize, and again, that contextual help. The users list here. So this is going to be where we want to manage and create either local users, or if we're implementing LDAP, we'd come here to assign roles to users that are part of our directory server. So any new users would be added or managed here. Local users, you hit this plus icon in the top left here, and that would give you the ability to create a new username, password, and that would be local to the specific instance of SageVue. The LDAP we'll take a look at a little more detail here in just a bit. Network section off to the side here. So this network section is discovery for each product family. So these are the parameters that SageVue is going to work against when it's that SageVue manager is reaching out to try to communicate and discover all those devices that are out on the network. Network interfaces is going to show you, if you have a server that has 5 or 6 different network interfaces, you can pick and choose and enable and disable which of those you'd want to use. And then below is where we're going to manage discovery for all our product families. And so as we kind of click through this list here a bit, we'll see that the GUI is going to change a little bit, and that's dependent on the capabilities of each product family. So, with Tesira, we have, a subset of controls here, like for MDNS, these default network timeouts, even just simply enabling device discovery for that. We can turn on and off device discovery for all these product families. Devio behaves a little bit different. Devio, we need to provide a port number and a password for devices, as well as potentially sort of IP addresses for any devices that might be off of the local subnet. CrowdMike's Atom, username and password. CrowdMike's Atom uses strictly MDNS at this point via SageVue for discovery, so that's all going to be mostly local network discovery, and you're entering a username and password here. So SageVue is going to go out, look for CrowdMike Atom's devices. When it finds them, it's going to reference and try to confirm that username and password and log in. And if it's successful, you'll see that device populating in your device list. And then we have similar then configuration options for our data sound and Qt products here as well. SageVue does have a built-in scheduler. Scheduler gives you the options to manage the Tesira, Devio, and Atom product families. And options for these tasks here depend on the product family you've taken. So for example, for Devio, we could schedule auto setups at a particular time of day. Whereas if we look at Tesira, we can schedule firmware updates, preset recalls, things of that nature. So, if you have a large number of devices that you want to do firmware updates for at a particular time, you can come here to the event scheduler and push those out after hours. Device profiles, Tesira layouts, alert filters. We're going to take a look at all these in a bit more detail in future slides. The settings menu drop down here off to the left. These are all features that are sort of related to internal configuration within SageVue. So less interfacing with devices and systems directly, more configuring SageVue to work for you. And again, we'll take a look at a lot of these in more detail as we get through, as we start moving forward in the rest of our slides. History tab here. We'll close out the web GUI tour with this. History tab here is going to show you really anything that's been done within SageVue in that point in time. So if you've created a bunch of labels or asset groups and put all your devices in there, and you come back and things are changed, you can use this as sort of a point of record to see if maybe someone had logged in and made some alterations or changes after the fact. So this will keep a record of essentially everything that you've done within SageVue over a point in time. Okay, I want to move away from the web GUI now and talk a little bit more about some of these additional features in more depth. In particular, I want to start out with managing users and access into SageVue. And so we have a number of ways here that we can sort of limit or control access to SageVue itself. And then once you're in SageVue, limit and access control to the devices that SageVue's managing. And I think it'd be helpful here to start out with a quick overview or reference to Tesira security, because a good bit of the security within SageVue is in some way related. So Tesira has the ability to protect systems via Tesira software. So a system's installed and commissioned that can then be secured with the username and password. So anyone trying to access, make changes or updates to that system will are required to enter that username and password. We have multiple sort of privilege levels here, all the way from an administrator who has access to everything down to an observer role that's essentially look but can't touch. That concept sort of tracks over to SageVue. We have the administrator role. We saw that set up during the initial installation and activation. We have a monitor role within SageVue, so you can log in, and again, similar to that observer role, you can look, but you can't really change or interact with anything. But that's sort of where the defined role level stops. We have these 3 additional roles within SageVue that are referred to as maintenance roles, and by default, those are maintenance roles A, B, and C. And those maintenance roles, the names for those are completely customizable. So if you have, maybe tiered support on site, or a third-party team that comes in for events on nights and weekends, you can give them access to SageVue, but you can really tailor that to work for that specific group. So those names are customizable, and that access is customizable. So, and that's really any sort of lever you can pull, button you can press within SageVue, we can enable or disable for these different user roles. And so what that looks like when you're setting this up, the GUI itself is going to tailor itself to each one of those roles. So here we have an example of that left-hand menu that we took a look at in the web GUI. The admin role on the far left, all the way down to some weekend event support that comes on site and really just needs to be able to see some of the systems and devices to confirm that either they're online or verify IP addresses of equipment, things of that nature. So the SageVue web interface itself is going to tailor itself based on those profiles. The menu will change. We'll have buttons grayed out, missing. The sort of look and feel of that web GUI is going to be customized for each one of those maintenance groups. So along with limiting and controlling access to SageVue itself, even once you're in SageVue, we can limit and control access to systems and devices. And so we're going to talk a little bit about security here. So system protection within SageVue, that's very similar to the Tesira security that we started this section out with. That can be managed from the systems section within SageVue via those convenience buttons and that padlock icon we took a quick look at. Clicking on that padlock icon is going to prompt you to enter an admin password to protect the system. Once you enter that password, padlock icon is going to snap shut. When you're looking at your system list there off to the right, you'll get a new column, protected column, and it's going to show you a padlock icon for any systems that have had system protection enabled. And then in turn, that translates over to anything you want to do or interact with that particular device or system. So clearing a configuration. From SageVue, you'll be prompted for that admin username and that password you created. And this goes both ways. So if you have someone come on site and they're looking to make changes via Tesira software, they're going to be prompted for that same admin username and password. So this is a way from SageVue that you can secure these systems in similar capacity to what you can do within Tesira software. However, SageVue also has this additional feature called SageVue Control, and it's really just that. It's complete control from SageVue, no direct access from anything else. Similar to system protection, that's managed from the systems menu, those convenience buttons in the top right, and it's that sort of super SageVue S icon we see there. When you click on that, you'll get a helpful dialog that sort of describes what that feature is doing. Preventing all non-SageVue accounts from accessing the Tesira system. And probably the most important thing here is this includes Tesira software users and third-party control systems. So with that enabled, you'll get, similar to that padlock icon in the protected column, you'll get an S icon to let you know that that system and devices are under SageVue control. But what about that third party or software? So obviously, this limits the ability of Tesira software, Biamp Canvas, and any third-party control system to access that Tesira system. So we have this concept of a controller role. And so once SageVue control is enabled, you'll get an icon in those convenience buttons to create this Tesira controller user. So you'll enter a username and password there. Once you get confirmation of that, you can give that username and password to your programmer who might be implementing Biamp Canvas, or your third-party control system programmer. They'll be able to use those credentials to connect and provide that service. Otherwise, everything else will need to be done from SageVue at that point until control is released. And want to close this user access section out just to run through LDAP. LDAP, it's a pretty understood protocol at this point. It's used every day, whether we know it or not. In your enterprise environment, likely it's more commonplace. See that implemented. Microsoft Active Directory is a good example of where we'll find that. LDAP being just sort of a way for a client to interact and search through a directory server. And that's really what we're doing here. When we enable LDAP within SageVue, we're enabling an LDAP client. That can reach out to that directory server and associate SageVue access roles with users in that directory. A couple steps to get that up and running. First, we need to enable the LDAP client by setting that to on. We need to give it a host name or IP address here. If you're not the one managing the directory server on site here, you'll likely need to get IT involved, whoever's in charge of that to get this information. So enter the host name, IP address, host number, IP address of the directory server. Ports here need to be entered. That's either going to be port 389 or port 636, depending on whether you're doing encrypted or unencrypted connections. We need to provide a base distinguished name that again should come from the administrator for that directory server. And this is essentially telling the SageVue LDAP client where it needs to start its search from on that directory server. We have a use SSL on button here. If you're using port 636 for encrypted connections, you're going to want to turn that on. And SageVue supports two authentication methods to connect to the directory server. Anonymous being no username or password required, assuming that the directory server supports that. Otherwise, we'd select simple here, and then you need to provide a username and password that are authorized to access and connect to that server. And finally, we've got this clear LDAP cache button. I just want to highlight and point that out. It's a newer feature related to the LDAP configuration. And this is going to come into play primarily if you're making changes to the LDAP server in concert with sort of installing and setting up SageVue. So let's say maybe a group was changed or created specifically for SageVue support on the LDAP server. We can go ahead and clear the cache on the SageVue end, and SageVue should go out and search and find those changes that were recently made. I believe that cache is maintained for about 15 minutes there, in case you're curious. Once we're all configured on that LDAP page, we can go back to that users menu, select the LDAP users option in the top there. And right off the bat, we're going to be presented with all of the information that's returned against that base distinguished name that was entered. And now, depending on the base distinguished name itself, this view is going to vary. So here's an example of we're seeing these objects on the directory server called organizational units. You could really just think of these as folders similar to what you're navigating through on your Windows machine. So if you're presented with a folder like this on the LDAP user screen, you can just click on that folder icon and start. Essentially, at that point, you're navigating through the directory looking for the users that you want to associate a SageVue role with. Optionally, that base distinguished name could be entered to be a bit more granular, point directly to the user's location. Either way you get there, once you get to a folder that actually has users in it, you'll have a checkbox off to the left there. So you check the appropriate user, hit that edit icon, edit pencil icon there that's above the list, and you're able to assign a role to that specific user. Worth noting, creating local users, the GUI here is the same. You'd enter a name, username, email address, password. When we're talking about LDAP here, all of this other than the user role is read-only, right? We're just pulling this information in from the directory server and then associating a role with that. Also want to highlight LDAP groups. So that's groups is a very much an LDAP thing here, and it's a way where if you have different users in that directory server that are sort of located in different portions of that directory tree, you can associate them to a single LDAP group and sort of assign things to them as a whole, as a larger group. And so in the case of SageVue, you may have already existing AV support group in your LDAP directory. You may be creating a new one specifically for SageVue support and associating users with that group. So once that's done, we can hit this group icon that's highlighted in the top above the LDAP return list there. That's going to perform a different type of search and give us this pop-up window here, this assign role to LDAP groups. And so you can go through, find that specific group that's on the directory server. And when you assign that group a role, everyone in that group inherits that role. So if you have 5, 6, 7, 24 different AV tech support folks who are going to be assigned to that group, it'll give all of them that same administrator role. And at that point, they can use their their local common enterprise credentials to sign in. And so it's going to be same username and password that you're already using on your network to access email, and other similar services can now be used to access SageVue. Okay, moving on from sort of just user access and control, talk a bit about layouts and firmware. So Tesira Layouts can be imported into SageVue. I want to note that, especially for your Tesira programmers out there, importing these layouts must include a populated equipment table. And really what drives that is, this is meant to be a backup for systems, devices that SageVue is already monitoring out there on the network. So, Tesira Layout's going to be imported here. It'll have a populated equipment table that sort of correlates that Tesira configuration file with the physical hardware that's living out there on the network. And once, if you have the option to, after importing that, to actually send configurations out. And so it's going to reference that equipment table in the file, go to find that same hardware that's living out there on the network. Assuming that it can, it'll go ahead and send that configuration. And so as part of this step here, you can either update or keep the same system descriptions there. Hit that configure button. It's going to SageVue is going to send out that file to those devices, same as Tesira software would. So after a large install, say you have 75, 100 rooms or so that are coming online. Have all those different configuration files. Those can all be brought into SageVue as part of a backup. If there's small changes that need to be made, programmers can send you files. You can upload them into SageVue here and then push them out. If there's preset or routing changes that need to be made, someone doesn't necessarily need to come on site or remotely log in with the Tesira software. They can make those changes remote, send them to you, import them into SageVue, and deploy to get those updates needed. Firmware can be handled as well. So right now we support sending firmware to Tesira, Devio, and CrowdMike's devices. If you recall from the web GUI, that firmware update icon shows up in pretty much all our convenience button locations. GUI is pretty straightforward. You select update firmware, you select your product family at the top there, whether that's Tesira, Devio, or CrowdMike's Atom. The available firmware updates list then will sort of tailor itself to that particular product family. And then you'll have the corresponding devices that are on the network. You can select, a single device or multiple devices to force that firmware update out. And again, firmware updates can also be scheduled via the scheduler feature that we took a look at. SageVue will also, inform you on firmware updates in progress. So both that alarm bell notification in the top right there will let you know that the firmware updates are in process, as well as the status column in your device list there. Will give you an indication that firmware is updating for that device. Mentioned at the beginning, SageVue has an option to pull in firmware updates as they become available, assuming there's internet connection on this instance of SageVue. So that can be done from the settings menu via the updates button. automatically check for updates, turn that on. You can set the date and time. At that date and time, every day, SageVue is going to go out. If it sees that there's new firmware updates available, it'll pull them down and put them into a directory. Note that this is not updating firmware on the devices themselves. It is giving you that new firmware package that you in turn then can either manually update or schedule updates for. And then our last section here is going to cover really a lot of things that involve sort of a SageVue getting information to the outside world outside of that web GUI and or sort of remote access in some ways. And we're going to start with email alerts. So SageVue does have the ability to send out email alerts against faults or notifications that happen on devices. There are a couple configuration steps that need to be done here. First step is actually configuring SMTP server. Want to note that at this point in time, the SMTP configuration does not support multi-factor authentication. So in cases, I've ran into this recently, I think towards the end of last year with Office 365. And there's, in those cases, there's workflows typically to create a app password for third-party access. So just be aware that if you're in an environment that requires multi-factor authentication, you may need to investigate a app password workflow for this to work. We're also including here reference to a couple of the SMTP servers that we've tested sort of as part of creating this presentation here. But SMTP option is under the settings menu there. Fields are pretty self-explanatory. Enter the host name, associated port. We need the appropriate credentials for that user. Once we've saved those settings, we need to then tell SageVue, okay, so it's able to access the SMTP server. We need to tell SageVue who we want to send email alerts to. So user alerts are, we have a couple configuration options for that. So first we need to enable email alerts, and then we can sort of specify whether we want to send faults immediately as they occur, or if we want to do some sort of daily digest for faults. Then on top of that, we have a column there or a section here where we can define the email addresses for the recipients that we want to receive those faults for. And that's it. Once you set up that much, you'll start getting emails regarding faults and or notifications involved in SageVue. However, we have a little bit more fine tuning that we can do here via these alert filters and alert profiles. So essentially, alert filters and profiles give you the ability to sort of customize the destination for each individual alert. And so we have a GUI within the web browser here that allows you to go through and show all the different types of alerts that might be generated. And we can actually edit those and associate those with a particular custom alert profile. So those profiles, we can give that a custom name. We can apply that to all devices or specific to asset groups. Asset groups, if you one good example might be if you're defining your asset groups based on geographical locations. Maybe the support team in building A doesn't need to know about faults with devices in building B. So you can use this feature to sort of make sure that email alerts go to the appropriate group. Another use case I really like is, if you have a lot of VoIP heavy systems, you can go through, take all those VoIP faults. And so if there's a, unregistered or any sort of related VoIP issue, those faults will get sent directly to the team that can respond to that directly. So any sort of local VoIP support that's on site. Along with email alerts, we have this concept of cloud access. And cloud access is a way to give a sort of third-party support access to your instance of SageVue without them not necessarily needing to either remote in or be on your same network. They can actually view your instance of SageVue and any faults or alerts or things that are going on in real time via that connection. And that's through that sagevue.biamp.com, that portal where your gateway was registered during installation. A few steps to set that up. From the settings menu, we have a gateway option, and we first need to enable this cloud support feature. Once we've done this in the browser, that's actually all that needs to be done from the actual SageVue user interface. The local user is going to enable cloud support. Then they're going to need to log into sagevue.biamp.com. Once they're logged in there, they'll see a list of their gateway or gateways there, as well as a sort of cog icon on the top right. You're going to click on that cog icon. That's going to give you an option to add a service provider. You go ahead and throw the email address of the service provider in there, send that, and that's going to generate an email to them with a link that they can click. So your remote user who you sent that email to, they're going to click on that link. They're also going to be taken to SageVue.biamp.com where they'll need to use their credentials to log in. Once logged in, after clicking that link, it's going to expose this user portal section in the bottom right there. Clicking on that is then in turn going to give you a view into that user's gateway who sent you the invite. So you'll be able to click on that link, and that's going to take you automatically logged in right to their sort of a mirrored view of their instance of SageVue. And what we're showing here is the menu's filtered out a little bit, so you don't have all the exact same features and access that you do if you were locally logged in, but it's a good way to give some third-party support a view into your system. Maybe they can identify, help you identify devices that are currently in fault or having issues, and just look through, help walk through with configuration settings and things of that nature. So it's a potentially a nice feature there if you have some third-party support you need to get a look into your instance of SageVue. And probably one of my favorite probably one of my favorite features here as we come near to the end is going to be device profiles. And this is a way of setting, applying multiple settings or applying multiple settings to multiple Tesira devices. And they're really a subset of options that are available to us via device maintenance and Tesira software, as well as via the individual device configuration sections within SageVue. And so using these device profiles, we can enact changes and or monitor things related to network, VoIP, Beta 2.1x, and any sort of custom labeling assignments within SageVue. And probably my favorite part of this feature is the compliance monitoring, which we'll take a look at here as well. So by default, there's no device profiles created, so you need to create a new one. Once you've hit that plus icon, you can give it a name. And here we're going to use the example of Telnet, of forcing a rule for Telnet off. So thinking about this, you may have a large installation, again, lots of different Tesira rooms, but we have some requirements on the network that we need to have ports closed, such as Telnet or SSH. So we can come in here, give this device profile a name, activate it, hit that check Telnet box, the enable Telnet box, and keep that button to off. And so that's creating a profile that's going to go out there and look and make sure that Telnet's off on our devices. So once we've created that profile, we need to actually assign that profile to a device or devices that SageVue's monitoring. So that little clipboard icon off to the right, we'll click that. We'll get a list of any devices that we see on the network. And here at this point, we're not yet enacting the change to turn Telnet off, but we're associating these devices with that profile. Once they've been associated with that profile, we can turn on this monitor profile compliance. And what this is doing is SageVue is going to go out periodically and look for any devices that have been associated with that profile and confirm that they're adhering to the settings within that profile. So in this case, that Telnet's off. If it goes out and finds that Telnet's on that device, it's going to flag an alert in SageVue. And if you have email alerts set up, it's going to tell you that Telnet's on. We also have an option here via that clipboard icon to actually force these settings down to all the devices that are associated with that as well. So clicking on that will essentially is the same as going out into each one of those devices individually and turning Telnet off. So I think this can be a real powerful tool wherein you've done 75 or 100 rooms, and part of the sign off is Telnet and SSH need to be turned off. You can assign those profiles to the devices. Either push that all from SageVue or use the compliance monitoring to double check and ensure that all those devices have had those changes made. And if not, SageVue is going to let you know about that either directly in the web GUI here or via an email alert. And we have the API we mentioned. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this here. SageVue does utilize a RESTful API. We have a great help doc that's been put together that outlines sort of all the calls related to the different features and options within SageVue. This is really geared to programmers out there who are sort of already involved and actively doing this type of programming, and will be used again to sort of more commonly to implement the data that SageVue's gathering into a third-party network management system. But we do want to include a slide here that shows what some of this data looks like, at least some of the initial concepts to get started here. The screenshots I have here are from a program called Insomnia. There's a number of them out there that you can use to test and test API calls. But first step in using the API, regardless of what program you're doing or how you're implementing, is that we need to log in. And so when we log into SageVue, we need to provide it a set of credentials similar to logging into the web browser. Again, API is kind of doing and can do everything that the web browser can. So you kind of keep that concept in your head here. So we log in, and when we log in via the API, that login is going to return a ID and the role of those login credentials. And the ID is important here because logging in is first step, but then that ID needs to be included in all subsequent calls made to SageVue. So as we saw in this next example here, we're querying via the API to get the devices that are in our device list. And so that session ID is included as a header in there, just to authenticate and validate that we are sort of logged in and authenticated with a session, and then you get that data back. So just a concept to know, log in first. We have this login ID that then in turn needs to be used on all subsequent calls. Much deeper than that, I just encourage, if you have a programmer you're working with who's doing the API, get that document in their hands. And certainly if they have any questions, you and or them can reach out to support and be happy to help. And this last bit of slides here, as I see we've run a bit over time, so I do appreciate y'all hanging on there. Hopefully this will be good resources once you get this presentation in your hand. So we have a feature matrix here. This feature matrix is sort of highlighting, meant to help to be a reference for all the features that SageVue supports and which product families those features are enabled for. We have a couple of network topologies here that might be helpful, in driving any sort of future SageVue conversations you might be having, either internally with your team or with your customer. Down from sort of the simplest example here where, we have either a local PC or server running SageVue and we're monitoring a handful of devices that are there on the network, all the way to, a distributed campus where we have a dedicated server and a centralized location, and we've used IIS and DNS to give us external access to that. We can use any one of our support team's computers via web browser to access that on that network. And then blowing that out globally, right? If you've got multiple SageVue gateways registered, all over the country, all over the world, and you're using that API to bring all that information back to sort of a central operations center. Sort of bookending the presentation here at the beginning, we saw some of the installation process sort of in the program files folder. There's also a program data folder. Make sure you're all aware of. This is really where, if you're running this on a server, this is where the firmware updates, the Tesira layout library is going to be stored. SageVue does have backup capabilities via the web GUI as well too. So you spend all this time configuring LDAP, asset groups, labels, SMTP client. There's a import-export backup feature within the web GUI. And so this manager SMD file that we see here is essentially the holder of all those configuration options. And so, if you've gone through and done all that setup, you can back up the manager file via the web GUI, and that'll maintain those settings in the event that, if the server goes down and you need to reset this back up or install a new version of SageVue for whatever reason, you can then re-import this manager and maintain all those settings. And lastly, last slide here, we've included just some helpful links that were referenced throughout the presentation. We have the Biamp.com SageVue requests for downloading SageVue, immediate access to the SageVue portal, and then again, Cornerstone. I can't express enough how, what a great resource that is. So this support.biamp.com/SageVue is going to take you to all SageVue related, the API doc, deployment guides, and as time goes on, there'll be more and more articles available there to hopefully help answer SageVue related questions. And then certainly please reach out to support@biamp.com if you have any specific questions, either from this presentation or in the future as you explore SageVue. Yeah, please reach out, let us know. I'll be happy to help. So thank you everyone for coming out today. I'm wishing you all a great day and happy spring. And yeah, thank you. Catch you next time.